So I got to know Klaus a year ago. So my anecdotes are going to be coming just from a different angle. Since I never met Klaus in person, but we interacted via email and Zoom sessions. And as will become clear, we discovered something in common. And so when the question is, what are the best contributions of Klaus? Dus my intuitive response is to say perhaps they still have to come, because I think of Klaus as a very feisty individual who was on the move until his last breath. Like as has been mentioned, we didn't know how seriously ill he was, and 2 weeks before he transitioned, he had his wife sending us an email so that we knew that he was coming back to continue the conversation. So he was not planning on just disappearing. And sorry, and then dus the last time we saw him, that was indeed from his hospital bed, and I actually helped him the day before that meeting. And then he, I mean, to make sure that everything worked. And then he told me that he had told his doctors and his nurses that they had to wait with all the treatments until after the Zoom session, because he really was doing something very important for world peace, as one could say. And I honestly believe that there's something in Klaus' works that we really need to keep on looking at, because it may make a difference. And so how do I know Klaus personally? It's like through these emails that we started sharing. And so this is coming from an email from a year ago about this theory, or the 4 theories of language usage. So he writes to me, he sends me the paper also. He says, I'm in the process of writing about the 4 uses of language. Since you were interested in Gestalt switching, to me, it is as much to do with the use of metaphor as others already mentioned. So I thought I attached my first draft of the first 3 conceptions of using language. The individual subjective use of language deals with metaphor. And then the next thing he writes, and that's where this feistiness comes through. I'm sending you this unfinished piece because I recall X once taught you giving the steps toward the Gestalt switch, which I thought was a ridiculous request. And then towards the end of the attached, I'm coming close to what would be worthwhile to present at the Club of Remy. I wouldn't want to propose this, but if what I wrote gets you ideas of talking of this, I will support you with what I wrote. And then a couple of months, so this, the Gestalt switch. So this is a particular figure that showed up in Klaus's classes and everywhere. Just how the way I think of it is, how does the mind work with difference? And if we look at this question, like the difference that makes a difference, what does that tell us just about language and human communication? And so just that he was looking at Gestalt switching as focusing on better understanding difference. And then this what he did after sending me his paper, he then sent me this picture, and he said, now, can you see the Gestalt switch? Now, does anyone know what the secret is to the Gestalt switch here? Does anyone see the zebras? I don't hear anyone. So actually the secret is you have to turn it upside down. But I didn't immediately see that. It took me a while. But the bottom line of this is that it's telling the phenomenal data are identical. So what we're observing, we literally observe, and now in this case, of course, I had to turn it upside down to see the switch, but the Gestalt switching is about that phenomenally speaking, observationally speaking, it's identical, yet something switches in our human mind. And what is it that switching? What is going on there? And so if someone asks me, how can I put the contributions of Klaus Krippendorff in the proper perspective, then I would like to make a little detour. And this is something that Stuart Umpleby has already said many times. We actually need to go back to Plato and Aristotle and we need to get a better understanding what was going on between those two guys. And so I'm going to now offer a slightly different perspective than Fred earlier did. So does the question, as Stuart Umpleby says it, like, if we look at the Macy meetings and at all the cyberneticians, like which ones are clearly Platonic, which are Aristotelian, which is between the two, and what is the difference between Aristotle and Plato? And when I read Klaus, I clearly see him in conversation with Aristotle. So I think that maybe Klaus didn't really understand his Aristotle very well, but because for me, he's clearly having the same communication model as Aristotle. And so here I give you a figure that he had in many of his presentations, especially the last 2 years, where he kind of emphasizes, I'm a self in communication with another. And that's exactly what Aristotle is telling in the rhetoric. So if we today think of Aristotle as a determinist, that is actually for the following reason. That is, we actually don't know Aristotle personally. We know about him because we read about him. And what is happening when we read? Sorry about that. What is happening when we read? We actually are looking at scratches, and something is happening in our mind, resulting in the scratches actually getting meaning for us. And this now comes the punchline, so to say. This, how do we turn the scratches into something meaningful? That's with the aid of metaphor. And that was what was central to Klaus's work, but that's also the contribution of Aristotle. He's the first one to give us a theory of metaphor and say, hey, we need to think about that. And Aristotle, as can be said in a different way, he was someone interested in change and movement. So he was in the process of solving a problem, and we may not immediately understand the solution, but he was definitely aware that we need to understand change. So if we think of metaphor, then the message of Klaus is basically, if we do not get on top of a metaphor works, we will not be able to grasp the human condition. And of course, any cybernetician will now be reminded of Gordon Pask, who said something very similar. Cybernetics is a science of, or the art of manipulating defensible metaphors, showing how their work may be constructed and what can be inferred as a result of their existence. So, and this is then a quote from Klaus. The container metaphor is just one example or a common metaphor. Natural language is full of them. Friedrich Nietzsche characterized language as a mobile army of metaphors. And then he quotes the work of Anselm as showing that actually a lot of people are not aware of how many metaphors they use. And that is where I see the significance of Klaus's work, is how to understand how metaphors work. And now you don't see anything here because, as Klaus pointed out, and this is maybe the challenge for cyberneticians, human agency is not observable as such. So we can't see a mind in action. We actually need metaphors. And the best known metaphor, of course, is the computational machine metaphor. And then how I think of Klaus, he's actually going to give us an alternative metaphor to complement that computational machine metaphor. And that is the dramaturgical metaphor. And so when I read his work, he clearly puts this emphasis on that we're performing language. And now how can we connect this back to cybernetics? So this image is very famous in cybernetics. This is the chicken crutch, or the distinction that George Spencer Brown asked us to draw. And dus that is at the basis of laws of form. And so at first it can be that I'm now getting into the realm of the abstract, and it maybe seems not very relevant, but actually that distinction helps me introduce Aristotle's triangle of reference and the literature on semiotic triangles in general. And if you read Aristotle himself, he very clearly makes a distinction between the sensory processes and the discursive processes. And so there's the moment that Klaus says human agency is unobservable, it's actually reminding us, yes, there are discursive processes, and we need to think of them independent and separate of the sensory processes. So if I apply this sort of thinking to the scratch, dus then the question is, okay, what are we trying to communicate with that scratch? And again, this brings to the foreground that we are working with metaphors, and so that we have a choice how we continue working with metaphors. And now here I see the split in the field. Dus on the left, you have all the ones who stick with only one triangle and do whatever they want to do with it. But on the other side, you have Klaus Krippendorff, who actually took four triangles. So instead of one, he took four and he put them together. And he points out that there are these discursive or performative or creative processes. Here I applied it to language, but one clearly see the design process and the use process. And so, dus as a reminder, that's the figure of Klaus, where he identifies a self and another. And now the question is, how do we proceed with this? And I clearly see an opportunity to say, well, we need to put that in a diamond where we clearly see that we're working with a schema of distinctions, and we need to worry and wonder whether we acknowledge all these distinctions. And that, and now I'm getting to the end, that actually brings us back to George Spencer Brown. What he shows in his work on distinctions is that we actually switch among metaphors when we talk about the distinction. We either are Plato and we become a butcher, and distinctions is about cutting up nature at its joints. And so we go for the smallest possible particle and then we put it back together. Are we more like Aristotle? And I see that's where Klaus is going, that we say, no, and that's also, by the way, George Spencer Brown, they say, no, we're actually drawing a circle, and that becomes a container, and that helps us focus our thinking about it is what we are doing here. And so to give it as a closing sign, so when we really begin thinking about those metaphors, and we have a choice to kind of stick to the descriptive approach and think of everything as pictures, are we like loosen up and we say, no, actually, we do whatever we want to do, and we need to be more sensitive to that possibility that people may be doing something different from what we think. And what is just very important here is to recognize that there is this unobservable dimension that is just impossible to describe. So it's like meaningless to say I observe, but instead I must kind of say I'm pretending to be a computational machine. I'm pretending to be playing with containers. I'm pretending to be in a theater play. And then we can have a conversation going about what is going on with our human mind, so to say. And as I see it, does that Klaus is really trying to give us a frame that we can say we think in the midst of doing a variety of other activities. Well, if we stick in the descriptive approach, we're kind of left on our own into deciding now what is thinking exactly. All right, thank you. And this is the closing slide. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, this is rich. Marcus, you want to say something? Marcus, you muted.
Yes, well, I'm fascinated by these presentations, and I didn't know Klaus that well. I met him 3 times in my life. But one thing I really found useful, which is a merely cybernetic product, and probably some of you know it. He wrote this dictionary of cybernetics. Who knows it? No. Yeah, only 2 of the 14.
No.
Three. Oh, yeah. So if you know it, yeah.
Charles
So everybody
Francois.
knows it. So it's enough just to call the attention to it. I think it's the best thing that has been written. And if you read it, or if you consult it, you have an awe about the knowledgeability of the man who wrote that. I think it never. I haven't seen a full publication. I've always only seen copies of it. So Fred, has he ever published it?
It's in. I mean, I have a hard copy of it.
Oh, you have. Okay.
Yeah. Somewhere
Yes,
in that,
yes,
somewhere
he
back
had a
there on
little-
that shelf.
And
American
we have-
Society for Cybernetics published it.
Mhm.
I don't think it's available any other way.
Yes, today we have a lot of dictionaries, and we have them electronically and physically. We have a very thick thing of what was the Frenchman in Argentina, who edited this dictionary of systems.
Charles Francois.
François, yes.
Charles Francois.
And it's all very good, a huge work he did, But I would still like to look into Krippendorff's Dictionary of Cybernetics, because it's something very special and original. Now, I know he wrote several books. I don't know how many, but some are outside cybernetics. For example, what was it? Content analysis. Something very important in the methodology of science, and useful clearly as a handbook for content analysis. It's a heavy book, actually, in relation to the issue. And so one can see both sides, but I think everything he wrote outside of cybernetics was with a cybernetic perspective. He was a cybernetician through and through.
If my memory is correct, I think Klaus's dissertation was on content analysis.
Yeah.
It's heavily based on information theory, and Ashby was on his dissertation committee. And so it is related to cybernetics, even if we don't tend to hear about it very often.
And just to add to that, thanks, Marcus, very much for and bringing up the dictionary too, and Larry for your comment. I think one of the things that's so beautiful and so important about Klaus's work is, for him, it was an ongoing thing. So the idea that performing content analysis became important. But just as an example, he had written, I wish I had in front of me now. I had edited this book called Research and Reflexivity 30 years ago. And Klaus had a chapter in there on reconstructing communication methods, where he brought a cybernetic and reflexive perspective to doing content analysis. And in effect, it was pointing out how most people doing content analysis missed the point, right? Even though they were using his book on content analysis. And that was the importance of bringing the observer in. And he said something, well, first of all, as Larry and Bill had mentioned, the importance of context. And that someone doing a content analysis brings the context for seeing what is in the text. And at the point that they're doing the numerical analysis of looking for words and patterns, they are still bringing their idea of what is important to be looking at in the content analysis. And a lot of times that gets lost. So he wrote also about the idea of the content analysts also paying attention to the operational discourse of the community, the language community in which they were. So encouraging people doing content analysis to let go of the idea that you could say it's objective because it's in the text, rather than saying it includes me as an observer making choices. And once I make those choices of what a context might be, whether these were letters or writings of Aristotle, you're still bringing a perspective to this. And it also showed up in terms of how he thought about his emancipatory ideas of design. So it's a different it's a cybernetic understanding of the very mathematics and quantitative aspect of content analysis, which is being used, but in a sense, in an incomplete way.
Do you mind if I interrupt that? Well, not interrupt, Fred, because that was very interesting. And I've learned a lot about Klaus this afternoon. Most I didn't know. I did know quite a bit because I visited I visited Wikipedia, amongst other things, in the past. But I have a question which is really directed at probably mostly at Larry, and that is this. Between roughly 1980 and 1992, I was outside cybernetics, I was outside academia, I was working for a living as a school teacher and a school psychologist, and I missed a lot of what was happening in the field. And when I came back, various things were going on. I reconnected with Gordon Pask, who had been my supervisor, my mentor, and I think it was following Pask's death, can't remember. I went to a conference. Eventually, I started going to conferences again. Not really until the mid-90s did I begin to engage with the cybernetics community. I learned a lot through my friend Ranulph Glanville, who was then in the ASC and possibly he became the president at some point. So I went to a conference in Vienna, and Klaus was one of the speakers. And I saw the program, and I saw he was speaking about something to do with language, which is the pragmatics of human communication, basically a Batesonian view, which I was already familiar with, partly through my work with Pask, but partly from my general reading. So I encountered Klaus in the cloakroom or somewhere and introduced myself and said, I'm very, looking forward to you. Very interested in what you're talking about. And I said, are you, presumably you're familiar with the work of Gordon Pask? And he said, oh, Pask uses some kind of, machine metaphor. I don't have anything to do with that. And he was so dismissive. I found it surprising, shocking, but I thought this is not the behavior of a scholar, and I was very disappointed. And in years that followed, when there were online meetings and messaging on Sibcom, for example, 2 or 3 times, Klaus said disparaging things about Pask and his work or his theories, and I took it, both Paul Pangara and I took Klaus to task about that, and he eventually stopped doing this. And we were more or less amicable in the last few years, particularly Club of Remy and so on. And I had the pleasure in the last few years of Klaus's life of teaming up with him in terms of protesting against Russia and setting out a story about Russia and Ukraine. So that was that. So I've got no personal animosity against. Paul and I were trying to tell him he had a very narrow understanding of past work. So my question now is for Larry: is there any light you can shed on this business between Klaus and Pask? Because they both were interested in conversation. Many of the ideas and theories that they developed are similar. They're not exactly the same, but they're very similar. And it troubles me that there isn't a proper, that they never made friends, or they didn't become friends. It's almost as, in my mind, it's almost as serious as the split that happened between McCullough and Wiener eventually in their relationship. So, Larry, can you help me here?
Yeah, I'm not sure without speculating too much. Just as background, I regard myself as having 3 mentors in cybernetics, and Klaus was the first. Herbert Brun was one, and then Gordon Pask. I had a chance to spend 3 8-week sessions with Gordon at the Old Dominion University when I was there, and I was able to invite him, and I had time on my hands, and so we spent a lot of time talking. I wanted to get to understand Gordon's conversation theory in a non-technical way, which I couldn't do from his writing, but I could do from these many conversations that we had together. And by the time that last 8-week session was over, I felt I had that we had some compatibility, for lack of a better term, with that. Klaus had a strange relationship with celebrity. how can I better say this? It's almost a paradox. On the one hand, he wanted to differentiate himself from others, and so that his voice and his contributions could be heard. But to do that, he had to make distinctions, particularly with those that he never really had a personal relationship with. He never really had a chance to sit down and have conversations with him like I did. And it didn't apply just to Gordon. The same kind of, there's a similar relationship with Heinz von Forster, Roberto Maturana, Herbert Broom. For me, I'm here caught in, I'm not, I didn't feel caught in the middle. I felt caught in a place that was really to my advantage, in the sense that I could learn from this interaction that was going on, be sort of not person to person, but whenever I had a conversation with any of them, it goes back to the Akoff and Klaus. Akoff was a celebrity. I mean, there's no question, and he really reveled in it. And I think that irritated Klaus to a certain extent. He just couldn't. Akoff was a difficult person. It was difficult to have a conversation with him. Difficult to get him to give you any time to have a conversation. And so I saw that at that point back in the 70s, and then I saw it again with some of the other cyberneticians. He's critical of Norbert Wiener, Warren McCulloch. I think the ones he's least critical of that we're familiar with were Ross Ashby, his mentor, and Gregory Bateson, obviously. So I don't know if that throws any light on it. I personally, I have wanted, and I mentioned when I was back in the 80s when I was meeting with Gordon, wanted, and he approved, to try to find a way to present conversation theory in a non-technical way, in a way that a lay public, could understand. And I've never been able to get to that point. I'm still working on it, by the way, but I never get to that point. And I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's very insightful. So it wasn't just Gordon. There's a kind of, Gordon used to refer to these kind of reactions as immune responses. If you come across ideas which in some sense compete with yours, or, then a lot of people, it's a cognitive dissonance. You reject things instinctively almost just because they're a threat. And this is ironic because there's Klaus, who's got a very, very sophisticated understanding of language and pragmatics of communication. And you thought that he would have found within him ways of recognizing that as something negative rather than something open, positive, generous. And there's another little saying from Pask, which I found interesting. He had one of his last theorems was, remember he talked about concepts as beliefs or whatever we think, and a psychological individual is a system of concepts, and at the highest enough level, then we are concept. You're a concept. I'm a concept. We're ideas. That's what we are. Systems of ideas. And Pat Gordon would say, unlike concepts attract, like concepts repel. So that's this kind of phenomenon where you come across something which is very like you, and you don't have to deal with it. So you run away or you back off or whatever. Or if you hopefully you eventually get to the point where you make the effort to explore the differences in more detail. But that's, I say, to me, that's sad, because so much of what they were doing or did is similar. Not exactly the same.
Can I offer another context on this?
May I give a perspective? I literally try to do this in my presentation, and that is to say that there are two ways to think about communication. One is that you first make sure you understand how humans communicate, and then you include machines. And what I think happened is that someone defined conversation, communication, observation in a way that it included already machines. And so by including already machines, you can never talk about the machine as a metaphor, because you just don't see how it is constructed and created as an object, and that it is being used as a metaphor to understand how humans work. And so what I just think, Bernard, is that the difference between Pask and Klaus was one really of how can we communicate. And Klaus was trying to say we need to understand human communication. And by the way, Bill Rickmeyer said that beautifully. Klaus doesn't think there are like upper meta entities that have agencies. He says we are all humans interacting, and the meta constructs, they're all a figment of our imagination. And so I see really this movement about which metaphors shall we use, how do we talk about distinctions. And so in that way, I think it is sad that they perceived each other as being opposition.
Yeah. So I never spoke to Pask about Klaus. Well, I did speak to Klaus about Pask, and Pask and Klaus had misunderstandings. First of all, Pask was alive to all the humanness of communication, human interaction, alongside his eventual development of what were then known as adaptive teaching machines. So he wasn't tied to the machine metaphor. That became part of his theorizing to use machine metaphors. And the other thing is that his concept of the psychosocial unity, which he calls a P individual, which can be you are several psychological individuals in your one brain, and if we went dancing together, temporarily at least, we would be one psychosocial unity in two bodies. So he has this concept of the psychosocial unity, but it was always personalized. And we can say that the United States as a psychosocial system, for example, is embodied in the people. And its oneness, its agency is exemplified by the President of the United States. The fact there is somebody at the top who can exercise agency and autonomy, which affect or which speaks for the whole. So Klaus's criticism about meta and people giving agency to systems doesn't apply to Pask's theory of psychological individuals at all. It certainly applies to other people's concepts of orders of system and Nicholas Luhmann and all that stuff. But I'm sorry, I get a bit carried away defending Pask. But
Yeah,
if
I could add something to that. Just what I was trying to do at the beginning of I mean, I didn't go through the whole history of other papers of Klaus, but one of the reasons I told that story about Klaus mentioning the I'm not so sure story, which I think Larry had a similar experience, was, so this is a different take on what you're mentioning, Bernard, and it's not to discredit it at all. I just have a different perspective on it. And it also, with Larry, I was also at Old Dominion University when Gordon was there. But I didn't hear those comments from Klaus as being against Gordon the person, more as a disagreement with the ideas. And I think that he was very careful to frame it that way. The difficulty is that we don't always hear it that way, that we hear an attack on our ideas as an attack on our personhood. Well, I think that was his intent. But again, that was my take on putting a context.
I would like to think you're correct, but I know you're not, because I had one of my personal exchanges with Klaus. I can't remember where it was. He mentioned that when Ashby was at the BCL and Pask was there as a visitor, Ashby used to express annoyance when Pask came floating up, and Klaus was telling this anecdote as really a story against Pask and his personality. And he said Pask would come up going, "Ho, Ross, blah, blah," you know, he sort of get in. And according to Klaus, Ross didn't like it. And according to Klaus, you know, basically he was on Ross's side and found Pask a bit of a nuisance. But we're going back to 1960s or something like that. So it's out there, but I don't think it wasn't just about past ideas, put it that way around. There was opportunity for them to have met each other, encountered each other. So either one or the other could have sought the other out, I think. I wish they had, that's all. Let's say that, wish they had, because I certainly first tried to admit that Pask was a flawed character. You know, he wasn't a saint. And we shouldn't expect that Klaus was a saint either, or any of us is in that sense. We should all have compassion for each other as the flawed creatures that we are.
And I think, Bernard, part of the history that I bring to the perspective, I actually met Gordon around 1972, and it was at the University of Pennsylvania in this same, it was actually at the point where the operations research program was becoming social science, social system science, which Larry spoke about. Yeah. And the architect, who was at that time one of the heads of the AA, the Architecture Association in London, Roy Landau, was teaching at Penn and would invite anyone who was a colleague of his from England who was passing through Philadelphia to talk. Cedric Price came and talked. Gordon spoke, and Klaus was there in Roy Landau's small apartment. So my initial meeting with Gordon was one where Klaus was very much engaged with Gordon, and they had an absolutely delightful conversation. So it could be that for me, that's the history that I'm learning about. At the same time, they were actively disagreeing about key ideas, and this is back in 1972. So it could just be that my context is different than yours, or
oh no, you've provided some additional information, and that's fascinating. Yeah. I know Pask could be charming with everybody, including those who didn't like him, and who styled themselves as his enemies. He was always polite and courteous. That was his style, and I'm sure he would have enjoyed that conversation. I cannot speak for Klaus, but it sounds as though that was a moment. You know, that was a positive moment. Yeah, I liked it. That's where one of those conversations. I wish I'd been present, because you know, I wasn't around then. But that's good, because I didn't even know that. Thank you for it.
Yeah. Go ahead, Marcus.
Thank you, Fred and Larry. You were both at Penn University of Pennsylvania, and Russ was there, and Klaus was there. They were not in the same unit, because Russ had founded the Bush Center, and Klaus was at the Annenberg School of Communication. But they were working together. I was there in a seminar, and there was Russ and there was Klaus, and Fred was there as well. And so I would be interested in the intellectual interaction of Klaus and Russ. What were their different ways of observing, of conceptualizing, etc.?
Let me just comment. I never saw Russ Lakoff and Klaus Krippendorff in the same room. But the first course I took at the University of Pennsylvania was, of course, by Russ Lakoff, methodology of operations research. It didn't have anything to do with methodology. It also didn't have anything to do with operations research, but that's beside the point. But it was the reason I stayed there. If I relied on the other courses I was taking, I would have been gone. So that stuck in my mind. And when I took Klaus's courses, I would bring these things up. And it was there that I saw the intellectual differences between the two. And it had to do with topics like ideals or purpose. Purpose was a big one where they disagreed. I wish I could have had a chance to bring some of the ideas from Klaus's course back Russell Akoff, but as I said, Akoff wasn't available. Very difficult to get any of his time at all. So I just that comment, Fred.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, another aspect of it is that, so I had the odd position of my degree was from social systems science. So I studied with Russ Akoff, but I also taught in the Annenberg School with Klaus. And the occasions that you're mentioning, I don't recall Russ ever being in an Annenberg event. At the same time, Klaus came very often to the Bush Center or the Wharton, the home where Akoff had, where there are many other people whose at the time I didn't fully appreciate. Eric Trist, Fred Emery, Hassan Ozbakan, Wes Churchman, were people who moved through that. So Klaus was a participant in this other world apart from his Annenberg world, whereas I don't know that Russ ever went over to the other. And in those occasions, Klaus was a very eager participant, still challenging, this is getting back to Bernard, still challenging ideas, right? He was always going to be doing that, but contributing quite a lot of what a communication perspective and the importance of communication as a relational fundament of systems ideas.
I need to go back here a second. I did see Klaus and Akoff in the same room. It was at ASC conferences. Russell Akoff would come to ASC conferences, 81, 82. There was one in the early 2000s where I was sitting next to Klaus and Akoff. This was right near the end, but he gave a very good talk, and Klaus leaned over to me and says, "He's right, but you know," and it was that kind of thing.
Yeah, Russ also spoke at the 84 one that was in Philadelphia that Klaus helped organize. Yeah.
Yep.
Who else here have not talked yet? Claudia, Matches, are you there?
Yeah, but I'm only listening. I don't know enough to say anything.
I met Klaus only in person, I think only once in Troy, and a couple of times online. And I think what was always very apparent was his design background. And for me, it was also very interesting how he spoke as a designer, for example, about the design method phase, you know. So this return maybe, or this turn towards metaphor, as Fred read at the beginning, that's very interesting in a way. And I think there's also an opportunity again, maybe, to discuss the Platonic and the Aristotelian from a viewpoint of how language plays out. And that could be interesting in the context of Klaus's ideas, I think. And I encountered some of these like disagreements, but between cyberneticians. I think Ranulph and Klaus, sometimes they also did not always agree. But I think what is important is that there was nevertheless, I think, an agreement that the ideas of cybernetics depend on this like different views and this working out. And I think on this level, they were not disagreeing. And I think for us, maybe the work is to bring these things together again, rather than saying there is a divide. They're saying, okay, how do we bring these things together or even collide them in our space today, and how do we take them forward?
Well, if I may say so, I think this was a very systemic intervention because science, as we know it, lives on partitioning things, on focusing on the differences. And systemic thinking is very much concerned with synthesis, with integrating things, and with looking at what things have in common.
And
I
there were-
agree.
yeah, there were what some might consider some inconsistencies, but there's constructive inconsistencies. For example, when I was working on my dissertation, Klaus pushed very hard for me to do something quantitative. You'd think that would be obvious, majoring in operations research. But I was having some difficulty in doing that, but he pushed, and I did it. And that's despite the fact, if you read some of his stuff, maybe more recently, where he's very critical of mathematical approaches to cybernetics. He could do the mathematics. I mean, that wasn't the issue. Humberto Maturana is also that way. But this inconsistency, he was thinking about me when I was doing my dissertation. He's thinking about something else when he's talking about the mathematics of cybernetics. Another example quickly, he and Ranulph Glanville would often, because Claudia mentioned Ranulph, would disagree. I saw them in the same session arguing with each other. That was in 1982. And among the topics of disagreement was language. And it didn't have so much to do with the substance of what you might talk about. It had to do with whether or not it's worth having conversations or sessions at a conference on the topic of language. Ranulph would talk about language as being, he talked about the promiscuity of language. And that once you start a conversation on that topic, it goes nowhere. It just goes off into all kinds of directions. Klaus, on the other hand, was pretty adamant. Yes, maybe that's the case, but this is too important not to have the conversation. It's too important not to have sessions on the topic of language at ASC conferences, for example. Anyway, that just,
yeah. If I can add, I realize I'm being rude. I'm not raising my hand. I'm just speaking out. So I apologize for that. But just to build on what you're saying, Larry, this is, Klaus, especially in the last 20, 25 years of his life, took very much of a position that was a bridge between the Ernst von Glasersfeld's radical constructivism and Ken Gergen's social constructionism, and very often was criticized by either side, saying they saw him as being in the other camp. But what was special about him that feeds directly into what you're talking about is that a lot of people taking constructionist approaches, which he would agree with, would say, XYZ is a social construct, mathematics is a social construct, and just leave it at that. And with his interest in language and metaphor, he would push very hard at saying, yes, but how is it constructed? And we need to look at that. And how we look at it also brings us as observers in, saying what is our idea of language, whether we're relying on Wittgenstein's ideas of language or Searle, the more performative approaches. How is it that we actually go about the constructing? Which is an ongoing question, because we're still looking at ourselves, looking at it. And I think this is it's a conversation he was eager to have, but at the same time, there was not going to be an end to it. But backing up a little bit, the importance of saying, it's almost like he was adopting Maturana's position on the difficulty with the position of saying something is something else, what Maturana would refer to as ising. And here, he also relied very heavily on Pete Becker. I don't know if people are familiar with the anthropological philologist Pete Becker's use of the idea of looking at languages that don't have a copula, that don't have a verb to be, and how can we get along in our world without the verb to be? Because we're used to saying, this is design, this is cybernetics. How do we get around that? So this is also where Klaus's idea of challenging language became important. Yeah.
A comment on that, Fred. I like that very much. That was very interesting that Klaus would push for the conversation, even though, as the other chap, Roy Landau, would say they just don't get anywhere. was a kind of, and I hear what I'm hearing from with Klaus is what Gordon actually made quite explicit with conversation. He said conversation theory, because it's a second order theory, is open-ended.
Right.
There's no, you can never complete it. And Lars Lofgren said the same about his own auto logic, you know,
Right.
self-reference. It's open-ended, and Gordon said this isn't. It's in his 69 paper, extending the meaning of goal stuff. He said this isn't a reason for despair that we can't, you know, ever complete the theories. It's a reason for enjoyment that we are, or delight that we have this wonderful open-ended life. We can invent our lives, you know, we can be creative. This is an opportunity for us, for humankind in general, that it is open. It's always open. We can continue to invent or discover what languages and what to be human is, and carry on playing that game for a long, long time, all being well. But thank you, that's great.
Yeah, thanks. That's so nicely stated, Bernard. Thank you. Yeah.
Here,
So I would like, if I may
here, raise the
respond.
hand. Here,
Let her go and then I'll go.
okay, let her go.
No, I don't mean it that way. I mean, Jaimi.
Well, yeah, okay, that was a slip of the tongue, as I say. No, I want to quickly respond to Larry when he said that he thought it was a contradiction that Klaus made him do something mathematical while being critical of mathematics. But if you take Plato versus Aristotle and you actually try to think of both as problem solvers instead of solution givers, then I see very clearly that Klaus is not a Platonic person. He doesn't think there's something mystical and special about mathematics. He reduces it to the process of making distinctions at a very high level. And that brings in George Spencer Brown, and why Heinz von Förster was so super duper excited about laws of form. And so it sets up, it brings also in Husserl. So I see actually, instead of looking at contradictions, I see opportunities to shift our thinking and think about cybernetics as everything is interconnected, and how we see the connections depends on the distinctions we make, and there are consequences, and some of them are unintended, and some are good and some are bad, and so we try to imagine the feedback loops before we enact a decision. So anyway, I'll give it to Bill now. Yeah.
I've just commented, it was triggered by Bernard's question, but also some of the conversation. My experience was I got involved with initially with Society for General Systems Research because Stu Humpleby introduced me to that. And then we got involved with some of the ASC people, but that period of time from the mid 70s to the early 90s, there was just a whole series of different venues, mostly in the Society for General Systems Research, the American Society for Cybernetics, several Gordon research conferences, and a few other things that we organized around systems and science education. And what I found is, and I still find, having been in and out of the field now for 50 years and using it all the time, that they're different tribes, but it's still part of the same group. Systems people have things differently, and cyberneticians see things differently. There's some posturing or viewpoints by some folks that make cybernetics part of systems, and people say systems is part of cybernetics. But what's most important to me, I found, was that in addition to, or because of the nature of the ideas, they're different communities. The nature of their perspective within people who identify themselves primarily as cyberneticians tends to be different than it is for people who identify themselves as system scientists or practitioners. And I found that confusing at first. And so I was doing work. I was asked to organize the 25th anniversary or 25th annual conference for the SGSR, and then the 20th anniversary one for the ASC after conference that Larry had originally done. I think it was 79, you said. And then Stu Humpleby did one in DC like in 81. And then we did one out in California in 83. But what I found was that what attracted me to the ASC and the cyberneticians was that there was more of an emphasis both in their performance and in their language on conversation. And we would have more sessions about afterwards in the bar, and we'd have different kinds of discussions. And I think Larry is part of that magical mystery tour, maybe not, but we had a conference in '81 in Toronto. Then we went to another session in Montreal, and another session that Larry, you organized in Orono in Maine that included Heinz and Stafford and Gordon. I mean, I've got pictures from there that I can't show in public because everybody was drinking too much and the train was frozen. But they were really, really engaging, sticky kinds of interactions. Whereas with the systems community, I found them to be more presentation oriented rather than conversation oriented. And Klaus and Larry and Fred and myself and others, but Klaus in particular, some of the pictures I took a lot of photos at that time when I have pictures of Klaus at, I think in California, but it's certainly at several of the Gordon research conferences. And I have pictures of some with Fred, I have pictures of Larry and others. But there was a vibe, if you were from the 60s, there was a vibe to the ASC conferences and interactions and the people who had those kinds of getting together. And there were a number of different venues for doing it. And it was really, really a rich kind of fermentation period there, which I found really heady. And I think had a huge impact on sort of bringing people together from different portions of this transdisciplinary set of fields in ways that wouldn't have occurred otherwise. And I don't think have occurred as much since then. I do remember at a conference that there was, I think it was in 2005, that Stuart Umpleby organized in DC, ASC conference. And I know that Russ Akoff was there. I know that Mary Catherine Bateson was there. I know that Klaus was there. I know that Fred was not there because I was talking to Fred on the phone and wondering, he couldn't make it. And he said, but please say hi to Mary Catherine for me. And I said, oh yeah, I haven't seen her in a while. And actually it was your conversation, Fred, you and I on the phone about, I went up to Mary Catherine and we talked, and then that led to the invitation when I brought her to Salzburg and the Salzburg seminar, et cetera. What I remember is that Mary Catherine and Klaus were both there for the entire conference and engaged in the entire conversation. And they had featured roles. They were big time players, they were stars, but they participated and engaged. Russ helicoptered in. And I'm not singling it out for criticism. I'm just saying there are different kinds of interactive styles. And there's this element of that certainly was personified by Klaus every time I saw him, by Mary Catherine as I got to know her, and every time I saw her and did things with her over the next decade plus of this, again, participation, not just a participatory focus because it's intellectually part of their view of cybernetics, but how they engaged and interacted with people. And in professional venues, that's not always the case. It often tends to be more focused on performance in the sense of, going out there rather than participation. So that to me was a distinctive characteristic of Klaus, of Mary Catherine and some others, and of an awful lot of the cyberneticians or people who identify themselves as cyberneticians.
Jerry? Lucio? You haven't talked yet.
Yeah, thank you. I tuned in rather late because I had another meeting, but I found the historical aspects of this conversation to be literally fascinating. So my comments are incomplete, incomplete in the sense that I missed the talks themselves. But I do want to, I suppose, add something through my own brief interactions with Klaus, which were mainly limited to the Club of Remy conversations. And I found his capacity to use language that was transdisciplinary or metadisciplinary and yet very clearly communicated his feelings and emotions and beliefs, was absolutely fantastic. And I just so enjoyed the conversations with him from that perspective. And so I can't say more than that about him. The other point I would like to comment on, I guess, would be the comments from Marcus on this basic distinction between the systems view as being a holistic perspective versus the scientific or partitioning of that. And I think this is very deep and fundamental problem that is facing not only the cybernetic community, but the world in general. We have the notion of understanding or seeking to understand all systems, natural and otherwise, in terms of continuous functions. And this has reached its highest peak of glory, I suppose, in the mathematics of category theory, which apparently seeks to completely eliminate, I shouldn't put it, to minimize to an absolute limit of possibility of the role of semantics in the description of nature or of systems. On the other side is the role of, if you would, relational theory or theory of relations or relationships, which bases on that of the individual entity or object, which is then, by definition, a unit of the totality, that is a unit of the unity. And this notion then of competition, or not only competition, but composition of units into a unity seems to underlie this deep divide that I see the cybernetics community struggling with in its own way. And this is very much a linguistic issue, much as Bill Reclamauer has pointed out. It's views of language and what we intend to communicate. And with that comes the issue, if I may wander a bit here, comes the issue of how these minds are created. In other words, what capacity is developed in a mind when it undergoes the educational processes, such as Larry Richards pointed out in his own PhD experience, where the mind is forced to adapt or accept concepts that are outside the unity of thinking that it has. And this back and forth between units of thinking and unity of the system is really a deep issue that deserves a lot further discussion. I've said too much already. I stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Good, Rob. You want to say something? No?
Yes.
Yes, please go ahead.
I'm very impressed by the stories about the parties and the continuing conversation. I participated for a period, but when thinking about Klaus a few days ago, I also realized that there was a difference in between the people in Europe and the United States. Here in Europe, maybe it was the type that Gordon Path could introduce, but I remember the, you might say, nearly continuous sessions with white wine and conversation about many different types of things. And I still have that feeling that conversations are just much more than an exchange of information. So what I got out of these conversations is the fact that whatever it is that the other says, its main function in a conversation is that you think of something you haven't been thinking about before. So to my mind, conversation theory has a very different type of structure than most people seem to think. It is generating, making it possible for the other person to do something that's unpredictable. And I don't mean unpredictable in the sense of jumping off a skyscraper, but unpredictable in the sense of suddenly you tell me something and I think of something else. And while I'm thinking of something else, I don't even listen to you. And that was what I found the most rewarding of all the discussions that I had with different people. Surprisingly, I know nearly everybody here in the meeting, but it's not from a recent period. It's from the 1970s, 80s, and maybe the beginning of the 90s. So to me, conversation is a very unique event. It's listening to people and at the same time not listening, but thinking of something and developing things at the same time. So that's my contribution. And I was always really impressed with Klaus. That's why I'm, of course, so interested in this meeting, because he had that same ability. He didn't just listen. He listened to the point where he did not listen. And I thought that was particularly characteristic of intelligent people. That's my contribution.
Thank you, Gerard.
Thank you.
Thank you. Before we leave, I wanted to mention Jane Jorgensen is here. She was a student of Klaus in communication, and she would participate occasionally in some of our conversations, particularly when they're at Fred's house.
Any more? Lucille, you haven't said anything yet.
Yeah, with pleasure. I mean, this conversation was amazing, and all these anecdotes and mixed with concepts was really nice. I just want to add what was my personal memory. That when I met Klaus first time, it was I was a young researcher, and it was a conference in Atlanta, in Georgia, a conference of the ISSS. And it was even still living Anatole Rappaport. It was, and he played piano. I remember in the social dinner, he was playing piano, and it was a so beautiful atmosphere among all the people there. And so I had say private talk with Klaus that I didn't know before that moment, just through books or papers, and I immediately found a very fascinating person. I mean, a very brilliant mind with different perspectives. So he could tell, and he could interact with you, providing a different way looking at things. Usually, there's something that you didn't think before. So, and then it continued to be so original, and even in our 2 years meetings that I attended with you all. I mean, his contributions, his ideas were always very fertile and interesting. Well, I mean, agreeing or not agreeing, but anyway, it was always triggering something new perspective in the discourse. So that's my contribution.
Thank you. For the friends who we cannot see your video, do you have anything to say to our group? Jen, Kahan. And there is one calling in with a phone number.
That's me. That's Jerome. Can you hear me?
Oh,
Can you hear
yes.
me?
Yes. You haven't said
So
anything,
similar
Jerome.
to, well, I'm waiting for a train, so it's a busy day. I didn't want to miss the meeting though, so I've been listening. Listening is also a part of conversation, so I've enjoyed listening to this conversation. And just to say, I didn't know Klaus personally. I met him also via the Club of Remy, I guess 1.5, 2 years ago, as well as many of you. And I found him a fascinating personality. Certainly somebody that I'm 36 years old, would consider a role model. I consider myself a fighter, oftentimes in debates, in discussions. And I really enjoyed listening to Klaus and his very reasoned and respectful tone, even when very vehement debates and disputes were going on. So definitely somebody that I will reflect on for years. And I even decided to go to my participation. Sorry, the train is coming, so probably you cannot hear me.
Okay, thank you. Have a good trip. Thank you all for today's wonderful program.
I think Kahan may want to say something. Kahan?
Kahan, Jen, you want to say something? No? Okay. Let's close. Let's meet next time. Thank you.